The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty reservation land as Miguel Running Bear knelt beside a pile of weathered wood scraps. His calloused hands moved carefully over each piece, examining the warped boards and splitting planks that others had thrown away. At 62, Miguel had learned to see possibility where others saw only waste. His weathered face, lined with decades of hard work and quiet determination, focused intently on his task. The small trailer he called home sat behind him, its aluminum siding dented and faded from years of desert wind and rain. But it was the empty space beside it that consumed his thoughts, a cleared patch of earth where he dreamed of building something better. Not for himself, but for the children who visited his grandmother's stories every weekend. Miguel's grandmother, Elena, had been the keeper of Apache traditions in their small community. Before her death 3 years ago, children would gather in her living room every Saturday morning to hear the old stories, learn traditional songs, and understand their heritage. Since her passing, that tradition had died with her. Miguel felt the weight of that loss every day, knowing that precious knowledge was slipping away with each passing month. He sorted through the wood pieces methodically. A 2x4 with one good end. Several fence pickets with minor splits. A sheet of plywood that could be cut around the water damage. These were the building blocks of his dream, a small cultural center where he could continue his grandmother's work, where Apache children could learn their history and elders could share their wisdom. The reservation didn't have funds for such projects. The tribal council was already stretched thin maintaining essential services, the health clinic, the school, the community center that served as everything from meeting hall to emergency shelter. When Miguel had presented his idea 6 months ago, the response had been sympathetic but firm. There was no money for new construction. So Miguel had started collecting discarded materials. Every weekend, he drove his battered pickup truck to construction sites in the nearby towns, asking contractors if he could haul away their scraps. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with pity, but most were happy to let him clean up their waste. Slowly, his pile had grown. His daughter Sarah worried about him spending his retirement this way. She lived in Phoenix now, working as a nurse, and called every Sunday evening. "Dad, you're too old to be lifting heavy lumber," she would say. "Why don't you move to the city? I have space in my apartment." But Miguel couldn't leave. This land held the bones of his ancestors, the memories of his grandmother's voice, the laughter of children who needed to know where they came from. Besides, he had a promise to keep. Elena had made him swear, in her final days, that the stories wouldn't die with her. She had taught him every tale, every song, every ceremony that she knew. But knowledge without a place to share it was like water without a vessel, it would eventually be lost. As Miguel worked through his wood pile, sorting the usable pieces from the hopeless, he thought about the design he had sketched and resketched 100 times. A simple rectangular building, maybe 20 by 30 feet. Windows along the south wall to let in natural light. A stone circle in the center where children could sit for storytelling. Built-in shelves for books and artifacts. Nothing fancy, but something permanent. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke his concentration. A cloud of dust rose from the dirt road that led to his trailer. Miguel squinted against the morning sun, trying to identify the visitor. It wasn't the familiar shape of his neighbor's car or the postal service truck. A large pickup truck came into view, much newer and cleaner than Miguel's old Ford. It pulled up near his work area and stopped. Through the windshield, Miguel could see a man in a cowboy hat, someone he didn't immediately recognize. The driver's door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. He wore clean jeans, work boots, and a button-down shirt that looked like it had been ironed that morning. Everything about him suggested prosperity, from his well-maintained truck to his confident bearing. He was younger than Miguel, probably in his 40s, with sandy hair and pale skin that marked him as an outsider to the reservation. "Morning," the stranger called out, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice carried the slow drawl of someone who had spent his life in rural areas. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Miguel stood slowly, his knees protesting after an hour of kneeling on hard ground. He wiped his hands on his jeans and studied the newcomer with cautious curiosity. In his experience, unexpected visitors usually brought either very good news or very bad news. There wasn't much middle ground. Can I help you? Miguel asked, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. The man walked closer, and Miguel could see his face more clearly. He had kind eyes, the sort that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting in the sun. But there was also something tentative in his manner, as if he wasn't quite sure of his welcome. My name's Tom Bennett, the stranger said, extending his hand. I own the ranch about 5 miles east of here. The Circle B. Miguel knew the place by reputation. It was one of the larger spreads in the area, several thousand acres of grazing land that had been in the Bennett family for generations. He had seen their cattle trucks on the highway and heard older tribal members speak of past boundary disputes, though those had been settled decades ago. Miguel Running Bear, he replied, accepting the handshake. Tom's grip was firm but not aggressive, the grip of a man accustomed to physical work. Mr. Running Bear, I've been watching you collect building materials for the past few months, Tom said, glancing at the sorted wood pile. My foreman drives this road twice a week, and he mentioned seeing you working out here. I have to say, I'm curious about what you're planning to build. Miguel felt a familiar defensiveness rise in his chest. Over the years, he had learned that when white ranchers showed interest in reservation activities, it was often because they saw some threat to their own interests. Water rights, land use, environmental regulations, there were a dozen ways that tribal projects could complicate the lives of neighboring property owners. Nothing that would affect your ranch, Miguel said carefully. Just a small building for community use. Tom nodded, seeming to sense Miguel's wariness. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said. Actually, I'm here because I might be able to help. Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly. This was unexpected. You see, Tom continued, we just finished a major renovation of our main barn. New roof, new siding, complete electrical upgrade. The contractor left us with a substantial pile of leftover materials, good lumber, not scraps. My wife keeps telling me to get rid of it because it's cluttering up the yard. Miguel remained silent, waiting to hear what came next. In his experience, nothing was ever given away without strings attached. I was wondering if you might have use for some fresh lumber, Tom said. 2x8s, 2x10s, plywood, roofing materials. It's all first quality, and it's just sitting there taking up space. The offer hung in the air between them like morning mist. Miguel studied Tom's face, looking for signs of ulterior motives, hidden agendas, or the kind of condescending charity that he had encountered before. But he saw only genuine interest and, perhaps a touch of nervous anticipation. Why? Miguel asked simply. Tom was quiet for a moment, looking out across the reservation landscape toward the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more personal. My grandfather built that ranch, he said. Started with nothing but determination and a head full of dreams. He used to tell me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates, but by what he builds for future generations. He turned back to Miguel. I can see you're trying to build something important here. My foreman told me you've been at this for months, collecting materials bit by bit. That kind of dedication reminds me of my grandfather's stories. Miguel felt some of his suspicion begin to fade. There was something in Tom's manner that suggested sincerity, but decades of disappointment had taught him to be cautious. What would you want in return? He asked. Nothing, Tom said immediately. No strings, no favors, no obligations. I just have materials I don't need, and you clearly have a project that could use them. Miguel walked over to his wood pile and picked up one of the better pieces, a 2x4 that was straight but marked with nail holes and surface scratches. He held it up in the morning light, examining its flaws and possibilities. "This lumber," he said, gesturing to his collection, "it's not much to look at. But every piece has a story. This board might have been part of someone's fence, or a child's treehouse, or a workshop where a man fixed his family's belongings. When I use it in my building, those stories become part of the foundation." Tom listened intently, and Miguel continued. "I've been building this project one scrap at a time because that's how my people have always survived. We take what others discard, and we make it into something valuable. It's not just about the wood, it's about proving that broken things can be made whole again." "What are you building?" Tom asked, his curiosity clearly genuine. Miguel set down the board and looked toward the empty space beside his trailer. In his mind, he could see the finished building as clearly as if it already existed. "A place for our children to learn who they are," he said. "My grandmother used to teach Apache history and traditions in her living room. When she died, that teaching died with her. Too many of our young people are growing up without knowing their heritage, their language, their connection to this land." He paused, remembering Elena's voice as she told the old stories. "I want to build a cultural center where elders can share their knowledge and children can learn the traditions that kept our people strong through centuries of hardship. Nothing fancy, just a simple building where the past can meet the future." Tom was quiet for several minutes, absorbing Miguel's words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new level of respect. "How much lumber would you need for something like that?" Miguel had done the calculations many times. For the basic structure, maybe 15,000 board feet of framing lumber, plus plywood for sheathing and roofing materials. "It would take me years to collect that much from scraps, assuming I could find enough good pieces." "I think we might have what you need," Tom said. "Would you be willing to take a look at what I have available?" Miguel felt his heart rate increase slightly. The possibility of actually having enough quality materials to complete his project seemed almost too good to believe. "I could drive over this afternoon," he said. "That would be perfect," Tom replied. "My wife Ellen will be there too. She's been after me to clear out that lumber pile for months." "You'd actually be doing us a favor." As Tom walked back to his truck, Miguel found himself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion, hope. For months, he had been working toward his goal with determination but little expectation of rapid progress. The idea that he might actually be able to start construction soon was both exciting and terrifying. Tom paused with his hand on the truck door. "Mr. Running Bear," he said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what made you decide to take on this project? Building something like this is a big undertaking for anyone, especially working alone." Miguel thought about the question as he watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. How could he explain the weight of cultural responsibility, the fear of letting traditions disappear, the promise made to a dying grandmother? "When my grandmother was young," he said finally, "the government tried to erase our culture. They took children away from their families and sent them to schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache, to practice our ceremonies, to remember who they were. My grandmother survived that, but many didn't." The hawk cried once and disappeared behind a stand of cottonwood trees. "She spent her whole life working to preserve what the schools tried to destroy. Before she died, she made me promise to continue that work. I'm 62 years old, Mr. Bennett. I don't have unlimited time to keep that promise." Tom nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "I'll see you this afternoon." As the dust cloud from Tom's truck faded in the distance, Miguel stood among his pile of salvaged lumber and tried to process what had just happened. In his experience, good fortune usually came disguised as something else, or it came with a price that wasn't immediately apparent. But, as he looked at his sketched plans and, then, at the cleared ground where his building would stand, Miguel allowed himself to imagine the possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, help arrived exactly when it was needed most. The morning sun climbed higher, and Miguel returned to his sorting. But, now, as he handled each piece of weathered wood, he found himself thinking not about what he could build with scraps, but about what he might accomplish with the right tools for the job. For the first time in months, the dream felt within reach. The afternoon heat shimmered off the asphalt as Miguel drove his weathered pickup truck toward the Circle B ranch. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, betraying the nervous energy that coursed through him despite his outward calm. The truck's engine rattled with the distinctive sound of a vehicle that had seen better decades, but it carried him steadily along the county road that separated the reservation from the sprawling ranches beyond. Miguel had changed into his best shirt, a blue button-down that Sarah had given him for Christmas 2 years ago. It still looked presentable, though it showed the careful mending that marked the clothes of someone who made every garment last as long as possible. He wanted to make a good impression, not out of pride, but out of respect for the opportunity that Tom Bennett was offering. The landscape changed subtly as he left tribal land. The same desert plants grew on both sides of the invisible boundary, the same red rock formations jutted from the earth, but somehow the ranch land looked more manicured. Fence lines were straighter, roads were better maintained, and the cattle he passed appeared sleeker and more uniform than the mixed herds that grazed on reservation pastures. The Circle B's entrance was marked by a wooden archway that spanned the gravel road leading to the main compound. The ranch brand was burned into the crossbeam, and beneath it hung a smaller sign reading EST 1887. Miguel noted the date with interest, the same year that his own great-grandfather had been forced onto the reservation, ending centuries of free movement across this very landscape. He pushed the historical irony aside and focused on the present. Whatever had happened in the past, today offered a chance to build something positive. Elena had always taught him that dwelling on old injustices was like drinking poison and expecting your enemies to die. The wise person learned from history but didn't become its prisoner. The road curved through a grove of mature cottonwood trees before opening into a large clearing where the ranch buildings were clustered. Miguel was impressed despite himself. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure with a red tile roof, surrounded by carefully tended gardens that somehow thrived in the desert climate. Outbuildings were arranged in logical order, barns, equipment sheds, worker housing, and corrals all positioned to maximize efficiency and minimize unnecessary travel. But it was the pile of lumber behind the largest barn that captured Miguel's attention immediately. Even from a distance, he could see that Tom hadn't exaggerated. Neat stacks of fresh lumber were covered with blue tarps to protect them from the weather. The quantity was substantial, far more than Miguel had dared to hope for. Tom emerged from the main house as Miguel parked near the barn. He was followed by a woman in her early 40s with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and boots like her husband, but her movements carried the fluid grace of someone equally at home in a boardroom or a barnyard. Miguel recognized her type, ranch wives who could manage complex agricultural operations while raising families and maintaining households that served as social centers for scattered rural communities. "Miguel, glad you could make it," Tom called out as he approached. "This is my wife Ellen." "Ellen, this is Miguel Running Bear, the gentleman I told you about." Ellen stepped forward with a warm smile and extended her hand. Her grip was firm and direct, her eyes friendly but assessing. Miguel had the distinct impression that while Tom might make the day-to-day decisions about ranch operations, Ellen's approval would be crucial for anything involving family resources. "Mr. Running Bear, Tom's been telling me about your building project," she said. "I think what you're trying to do sounds wonderful. This community needs more places where children can learn about their heritage." Miguel was struck by her immediate acceptance of his goals. In his experience, many outsiders viewed native cultural preservation efforts with benign tolerance at best, and suspicious resistance at worst. Ellen's enthusiasm seemed genuine. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett," he replied. "Your husband's offer is more generous than I expected." "Please, call me Ellen," she said. "And, honestly, you'd be doing us a favor by taking some of this lumber off our hands. Come on, let me show you what we have." They walked toward the barn, and Miguel was amazed by the organization of the ranch operation. Every tool had its place, every piece of equipment was clean and well-maintained. It spoke of the kind of systematic thinking and long-term planning that had kept the ranch profitable for over a century. Behind the barn, the lumber pile was even more impressive up close. Stacks of 2x8 and 2x10 dimensional lumber stretched for 30 feet. Sheets of half-inch plywood were neatly arranged in separate piles, still wrapped in the protective plastic from the lumber yard. Boxes of roofing materials, electrical supplies, and hardware were organized by type and clearly labeled. We ordered about 20% more than we thought we'd need for the barn renovation, Tom explained. Experience has taught us that it's better to have too much than to run short in the middle of a project. But the contractor's crew was more efficient than expected, and we ended up with all this surplus. Miguel walked slowly around the lumber stacks, running his hands over the smooth surfaces of boards that had never been used. The contrast with his collection of salvaged materials was striking. This lumber was straight, clean, and free of the nail holes, paint stains, and weather damage that marked every piece of his scrounged collection. "How much would you estimate is here?" he asked. Ellen consulted a clipboard that she had brought from the house. "According to our receipts, about 18,000 board feet of framing lumber, plus 40 sheets of plywood, roofing materials for approximately 1,200 square feet, and miscellaneous hardware." The numbers were staggering. Miguel quickly calculated that the retail value of these materials would be well beyond his limited financial resources. Even if he worked extra jobs and saved every penny for 2 years, he couldn't afford to purchase lumber of this quality. "This is far more than I could have hoped for," he said quietly. "But I need to ask directly, what would you want in exchange?" Materials like this represent a significant investment. Tom and Ellen exchanged a glance that spoke of conversations they had already had on this subject. "We've talked about this," Ellen said. "We want nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing that these materials will be used for something meaningful." Miguel had learned to be suspicious of claims that seemed too good to be true, but the Bennett's manner suggested complete sincerity. Still, he felt compelled to understand their motivations. "Why?" he asked. "You don't know me, and this project won't benefit you directly." Tom removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that Miguel recognized as a sign of someone choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Running Bear, Miguel, can I tell you a story about my grandfather?" Miguel nodded, settling into the listening posture that Elena had taught him was essential for receiving important information. "Granddad started this ranch in 1887 with nothing but a wagon, 2 horses, and a determination to build something lasting," Tom began. "The first winter nearly killed him. He didn't understand the local weather patterns, he made mistakes with water management, and he lost most of his initial livestock to a late blizzard." Tom gestured toward the mountains visible in the distance. He was about ready to give up and head back to Kansas when an old Apache man found him half-frozen in an arroyo about 10 miles from here. The man could have ridden past. Granddad was just another white settler trying to take Indian land. But, instead, he took Granddad back to his camp and nursed him back to health. Miguel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Stories like this were rare in his experience, though not unknown. Apache oral tradition included tales of individuals who chose compassion over conflict, even during the darkest periods of cultural collision. "The Apache man's name was Joseph Running Bear," Tom continued. "When Granddad recovered, Joseph taught him which water sources were reliable, how to read the weather signs, and where to find shelter during winter storms. Without that help, the Circle B never would have survived its first year." The surname hit Miguel like a physical blow. Running Bear was not a common name, even among Apache families. The possibility that this Joseph was a relative seemed very high. "Joseph spent 3 days teaching Granddad the basics of surviving in this country," Tom went on. "When he left, he told Granddad that the land was big enough for everyone if people were willing to help each other instead of fighting each other." Ellen picked up the story. Tom's grandfather told that story to his children, and they told it to their children. It's been part of our family history for 4 generations. The idea that this ranch exists because of an Apache man's kindness. Miguel's mind raced as he tried to process this information. Family stories were treasures that revealed connections across time and culture. If Tom's account was accurate, it suggested that his current situation was not just a random act of generosity, but part of a much older pattern of mutual assistance. Do you know what happened to Joseph? Miguel asked. Granddad tried to find him again, to thank him properly and maybe provide some help in return, Tom said. But, by the time he was established enough to reach out, Joseph had passed away. Granddad always regretted that he never got the chance to repay the kindness. Miguel walked to the edge of the lumber pile and looked out across the ranch toward the reservation. The land rolled away in gentle hills covered with sage and juniper, punctuated by red rock outcroppings that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and cooperation. Joseph Running Bear was my great-grandfather, he said quietly. The silence that followed was profound. Tom and Ellen stared at him with expressions of amazement that gradually transformed into something approaching awe. Are you certain? Ellen asked. Family oral tradition is very specific about names and dates, Miguel replied. Joseph Running Bear died in 1892, 5 years after helping a white rancher survive his first winter. My grandfather told me that story many times, always emphasizing that Joseph believed survival required cooperation between different peoples. Tom sat down heavily on a stack of lumber, as if the weight of this revelation required physical support. Then, this isn't coincidence, he said. This is. I don't know what to call it. My grandmother would have called it the working of ancient obligations, Miguel said. She believed that kindness creates debts that persist across generations, and that the universe eventually provides opportunities to balance the accounts. Ellen wiped her eyes, which had begun to tear up. Tom, do you realize what this means? Your grandfather spent his whole life wishing he could repay Joseph Running Bear, and now we have the chance to help Joseph's great-grandson. Miguel felt his own emotions rising. The idea that his current project might be connected to his great-grandfather's actions over a century ago was both humbling and inspiring. It suggested that Elena had been right about the persistence of good intentions across time. I want to make sure I understand correctly, he said. You're offering me these materials because you believe it's a way to honor an old debt? Partly that, Tom admitted. But also because what you're trying to build matters. Ellen and I have talked about the importance of preserving cultural traditions. We've seen what happens when communities lose connection to their heritage. Ellen nodded emphatically. Our own children live in cities now. They know the ranch history because we made sure to teach it to them, but many rural families aren't so lucky. Kids grow up without understanding where they came from or what their ancestors went through to give them opportunities. Miguel began to see the Bennett family in a new light. They weren't just successful ranchers offering charity to a struggling neighbor. They were people who understood the value of cultural continuity and the importance of passing traditions to future generations. If I accept these materials, he said, I want to make sure the story gets told correctly. The Cultural Center will include information about the historical relationships between Apache people and local ranching families. The children who learn there should know about cooperation as well as conflict. We'd be honored to have that story included, Tom said. In fact, we have some of Granddad's journals and photographs that might be useful. He documented the early years of the ranch pretty thoroughly. Ellen was already making plans. We could help you transport the materials to your building site. Tom's got a flatbed truck that would make the job much easier than trying to haul everything in your pickup. Miguel felt overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of his situation. This morning he had been sorting through discarded scraps, and now he was discussing the logistics of transporting enough quality lumber to complete his entire project. There's one more thing, he said. I want to involve the community in the construction. This can't just be Miguel Running Bear's building, it needs to belong to everyone who will use it. People who contribute their labor to the project will have a stronger investment in its success. Tom smiled. That sounds like something Joseph would have approved of. Granddad always said that Joseph emphasized cooperation and shared effort. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Miguel found himself planning the next steps of a project that had suddenly become much more realistic. With these materials and the community support he was confident he could generate, the cultural center could be completed before winter. But, more than that, he realized that the building would now carry a much deeper significance. It would be a symbol not just of Apache cultural preservation, but of the kind of cross-cultural cooperation that had made survival possible in this harsh but beautiful landscape. Elena would have been pleased. Her grandson was keeping his promise, but in a way that honored both the past and the possibilities of the future. The following Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the desert seem infinite. Miguel stood beside his trailer, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, and marveled at how much his world had changed in just 1 week. Behind him, neatly stacked under blue tarps, lay enough quality lumber to build his cultural center. The materials had been delivered in 3 trips on Tom Bennett's flatbed truck, with Tom and Ellen both insisting on helping with the unloading despite Miguel's protests. But lumber alone didn't build buildings. Miguel had spent the week spreading word throughout the reservation about the project and the community workday he had scheduled for today. The response had been more enthusiastic than he had dared hope. Word traveled fast in small communities, especially when it carried the kind of story that Miguel now had to tell. At 7 in the morning, the first volunteer arrived. Jimmy Crowfeather pulled up in a truck almost as old as Miguel's, followed by his 2 teenage sons. Jimmy was a carpenter by trade, working construction jobs in the surrounding towns when he could find them. His skills would be invaluable, but more important was what his presence represented: community endorsement of the project. "Miguel," Jimmy called out as he climbed from his truck. "I brought my tools and a couple extra hands. These boys need to learn how to work with their hands instead of staring at their phones all day." The teenagers, Marcus and David, looked appropriately embarrassed by their father's commentary but seemed genuinely interested in the building project. At 15 and 17, they were old enough to do real work and young enough to still find the prospect of construction exciting. "I can't pay wages," Miguel warned them. "This is volunteer labor for a community project." "Pay?" Jimmy laughed. "Man, I'm here because Mrs. Crowfeather told me that if I didn't volunteer, I'd be sleeping in the barn for a month. Besides, we need a place where these boys can learn about being Apache instead of just being angry teenagers." More vehicles began arriving as the morning progressed. Maria Santos came with her daughter and a thermos of coffee large enough to serve 20 people. Robert Begay brought a cooler full of ice water and his experience as a retired electrician. Frank Medicine Horse arrived with his grandson and announced that he had contacted the tribal building inspector to ensure that construction would meet all safety codes. By 8 o'clock, Miguel counted 15 adults and 8 children ranging in age from 10 to 17. It was a larger work party than he had expected, and the energy was infectious. People examined the building plans, discussed construction techniques, and began organizing themselves into work groups with the efficiency that marked communities accustomed to cooperative projects. At 8:30, an unexpected vehicle appeared on the access road. Tom Bennett's pickup truck approached slowly, as if the driver wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. Miguel walked over to meet him, curious about what had brought the rancher back to the reservation. Tom parked at the edge of the group and climbed out carefully, clearly conscious that he was the only non-Apache present. He had brought a toolbox and was dressed for physical labor, but his manner suggested uncertainty about his reception. "Morning, Miguel," he said. "I hope you don't mind me showing up unannounced. Ellen thought you might be able to use an extra pair of hands today." Miguel was touched by the gesture but concerned about the group dynamics. The relationship between local ranchers and the Apache community was generally polite but distant. Having Tom participate in a cultural project might feel intrusive to some of the volunteers. "You're welcome to stay," Miguel said, "but I should ask the group how they feel about it." He gathered the volunteers around the lumber pile and explained Tom's offer to help. The response was immediate and unanimously positive. Jimmy Crowfeather spoke for the group. "Any man willing to show up with tools and work clothes is welcome," he declared. "Besides, we heard about what your family did for Miguel's great-grandfather. That makes you part of this story." Tom's relief was visible as the group accepted him without reservation. Within minutes, he was deep in conversation with Robert Begay about electrical requirements and helping Marcus and David understand the basics of foundation layout. The work began with clearing and leveling the building site. The ground was typical reservation terrain, rocky soil with occasional patches of sand that had to be compacted properly to support a permanent structure. Miguel had chosen the location carefully, positioning the building to take advantage of natural drainage while providing easy access from the main road. As the volunteers worked, Miguel found himself thinking about the contrasts with his original plan. 3 weeks ago, he had envisioned building alone, using salvaged materials and working at whatever pace his aging body could sustain. Now he was supervising a coordinated construction project with community support and quality materials. The transformation felt like a minor miracle. Maria Santos proved to be a natural organizer, assigning tasks and ensuring that everyone stayed hydrated in the growing heat. Her daughter Rosa, a junior in high school, worked alongside the adults with the focused intensity of someone determined to prove her capabilities. The younger children were given jobs appropriate to their ages, sorting hardware, carrying tools, and cleaning up debris. By mid-morning, the foundation layout was complete and the group had begun the process of setting corner posts. This required coordinated effort, with several people working together to ensure that each post was plumb level and properly aligned with the building plans. Miguel was impressed by how quickly the volunteers had organized themselves into an effective work crew. Frank Medicine Horse proved to be a valuable supervisor, using his experience from decades in construction to anticipate problems and suggest solutions. When the group encountered an underground rock formation that interfered with one corner post, Frank directed the adjustment of the building layout by 2 feet to avoid costly excavation. In traditional Apache construction, he told the younger workers, "We always worked with the land instead of fighting it. A building that fights the earth will never be strong." The lunch break came at noon, with the temperature climbing toward 90 degrees. Maria had organized a potluck, and volunteers shared homemade tamales, sandwiches, and fresh fruit. Tom Bennett found himself seated on a hay bale between Jimmy Crowfeather and Robert Begay, discussing the challenges of electrical work in rural areas. Miguel watched the easy interaction between Tom and the Apache volunteers with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of cross-cultural cooperation that Elena had always advocated. Different backgrounds and experiences coming together around shared goals and mutual respect. Rosa Santos approached Miguel during lunch with a question that had been on her mind all morning. "Mr. Running Bear," she said, "I understand why we're building a cultural center, but how will we know if it actually works? How do we measure whether we're really preserving our traditions?" It was a thoughtful question from a young woman who was clearly thinking beyond the immediate project to its long-term implications. "That's something we'll have to figure out together," Miguel replied. "But I think the answer will be in whether young Apache people feel more connected to their heritage after spending time here." "What kind of programs will you offer?" Rosa asked. Miguel had been thinking about this question for months. "Language classes, definitely. Traditional arts and crafts. Storytelling sessions where elders can share history and legends. Maybe classes in traditional food preparation and plant identification." "What about modern stuff?" asked Marcus Crowfeather, who had been listening to the conversation. Like how our traditions apply to contemporary problems? Miguel smiled at the question. Absolutely. Traditional Apache values have a lot to say about environmental stewardship, community responsibility, and dealing with conflict. Those lessons are as relevant today as they were 2 centuries ago. Tom Bennett, sitting nearby, added his perspective. From what I've learned about Apache history, your ancestors were incredible problem solvers. They survived in one of the harshest environments in North America by being adaptable and resourceful. Those are skills that every generation needs. The afternoon work focused on framing the floor system. This required precise measurement and careful attention to building codes, since the floor would support all the weight of the finished structure. Robert Begay's electrical expertise proved invaluable as the group planned the routing of power lines and outlet placement. Miguel worked alongside David Crowfeather, teaching the 17-year-old how to read a tape measure accurately and make square cuts with a circular saw. The boy was a quick learner, and Miguel found himself thinking about Elena's teaching methods. She had always insisted that skills were best transmitted through hands-on experience combined with patient explanation. Why did you decide to build this place? David asked as they worked. Miguel considered how to explain the complex motivations behind the project. Have you ever felt like you were missing something important about being Apache? He asked. David nodded immediately. All the time. I know I'm supposed to be proud of my heritage, but nobody ever taught me what that actually means beyond the stuff you see in movies. That's exactly the problem this center is designed to address, Miguel said. Your great-grandmother knew songs and stories that went back centuries. She understood plant medicines and traditional ceremonies. But, when she died, that knowledge died with her because there was no place to pass it on systematically. They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, with David absorbing both the carpentry lesson and the larger explanation of cultural preservation. Will you teach traditional Apache skills? David asked. Like hunting and tracking? If there are elders willing to share that knowledge, Miguel replied. But, we'll also teach modern applications of traditional thinking. Apache people were always innovators, always finding new solutions to changing circumstances. As the afternoon progressed, the building began to take visible shape. The floor frame was nearly complete, and volunteers were already discussing the next steps in construction. The sense of collective accomplishment was palpable. People could see their combined efforts producing tangible results. Ellen Bennett arrived at 4 o'clock with a pickup truck full of cold drinks and homemade cookies. She had clearly been baking all morning, and her timing was perfect as the work crew was beginning to feel the effects of a long day in the heat. How's the progress? She asked Miguel as volunteers gathered around her truck. Better than I imagined possible, he replied honestly. These people have accomplished more in one day than I expected to finish in a month working alone. Ellen surveyed the construction site with the eye of someone familiar with building projects. It looks like you'll have the floor system finished by evening. What's next? Wall framing, Jimmy Crowfeather answered. If we can organize another workday next weekend, we should be able to get the walls up and maybe start on the roof structure. Miguel felt a surge of optimism as he considered the pace of progress. At this rate, the building could be enclosed and weatherproof before the end of summer. With the shell complete, interior work could proceed at a more leisurely pace throughout the fall. But, more important than the construction timeline was the sense of community ownership that was developing around the project. This was no longer Miguel running Bear's cultural center, it had become a collective endeavor that belonged to everyone who contributed labor, materials, or support. As the day wound down and volunteers began to clean up their tools, Miguel reflected on how much had changed since his encounter with Tom Bennett. The project had evolved from a personal mission into a community celebration of cooperation and cultural pride. Rosa Santos approached him as people prepared to leave. Mr. Running Bear, she said, I've been thinking about your question regarding how we measure success. I think maybe the success is already happening. Miguel looked at her curiously. Look around, Rosa continued. 2 weeks ago, most of these people didn't know about your project. Today they spent their Saturday working together, sharing skills, and talking about Apache traditions. The building is important, but maybe the real cultural preservation is happening right here, right now. Miguel looked around at the volunteers packing up tools, sharing final thoughts about next weekend's work, and making plans to bring additional helpers. Rosa was right. The process of building the cultural center was already accomplishing many of the goals that the finished building was designed to serve. As the last volunteer drove away and the sun settled toward the western mountains, Miguel stood beside his partially completed building and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Elena's voice seemed to whisper in the evening breeze, reminding him that the best way to honor the past was to build bridges to the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and continuing work, but tonight, Miguel Running Bear was content to know that his promise was being kept in ways that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. 3 months had passed since the first community work day, and the Apache Cultural Center had transformed from dream to near reality. The building stood completed on the outside, its fresh lumber weathering to a warm honey color that blended naturally with the desert landscape. Windows caught the morning light, and a hand-carved sign above the entrance bore the name Elena's Place in both English and Apache script, Miguel's tribute to his grandmother's memory. Inside, the work continued at a steady pace. Miguel arrived each morning before sunrise, spending quiet hours sanding trim boards or organizing educational materials that community members had contributed. The interior was taking shape according to his original vision, a central space for storytelling and gatherings, smaller rooms for classes and meetings, and display areas for traditional artifacts and contemporary Apache artwork. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the building itself. Over the course of construction, Miguel's project had catalyzed something unexpected, a renaissance of Apache cultural activity that extended far beyond the walls of any single structure. Elders who hadn't spoken Apache in decades had begun offering language lessons. Traditional artists were teaching beadwork and pottery to anyone willing to learn. Even young people like Rosa Santos and David Crowfeather had become active participants in cultural preservation efforts. This morning was special. Miguel had scheduled the first formal program for Elena's Place, a storytelling session where 3 tribal elders would share traditional tales with a group of children and teenagers. It would be both a test of the building's functionality and a symbol of its deeper purpose. As Miguel swept the main floor one final time, he heard vehicles approaching on the access road. The first to arrive was Frank Medicine Horse, carrying a large drum and accompanied by his grandson Danny, who had become one of the project's most enthusiastic young volunteers. Frank had agreed to open the session with traditional songs, creating the proper atmosphere for ancient stories. Beautiful morning for a beginning, Frank observed as he examined the completed interior. Your grandmother would be proud of this place. Miguel nodded, feeling Elena's presence strongly in the building that bore her name. I hope she would approve of how we're using it. More families arrived as the morning progressed. Maria Santos brought Rosa and 3 neighbor children. Jimmy Crowfeather came with Marcus and David, plus 2 teenage cousins visiting from another reservation. By 9 o'clock, Miguel counted 23 people gathered in the main room, a perfect number for the intimate atmosphere he had envisioned. But the morning held one more surprise. Tom and Ellen Bennett's pickup truck appeared on the road, moving slowly toward the cultural center. Miguel watched their approach with curiosity. The Bennetts had remained supportive throughout construction, occasionally checking on progress and offering additional assistance, but this was their first visit since the building's completion. Tom parked respectfully at the edge of the gathering and approached Miguel with obvious uncertainty about his welcome at what was clearly an Apache cultural event. Miguel, he said quietly, Ellen and I don't want to intrude, but we wondered if we might observe part of the storytelling session. We've never had the opportunity to hear traditional Apache stories. Miguel was touched by the request and the respectful way it was presented. He glanced at Frank Medicine Horse, who nodded approvingly. "You're welcome to stay," Miguel said. "This building exists because of cooperation between our communities. It's appropriate that you be here for its first official use." Ellen Bennett had brought a small gift, a handmade quilt in traditional Apache colors and patterns. "This is for the center," she explained. "I researched traditional designs and tried to create something that would be appropriate for the space." The quilt was beautiful, clearly representing hours of careful work and thoughtful attention to cultural details. Miguel accepted it with genuine gratitude, recognizing another symbol of the cross-cultural cooperation that had made the center possible. Frank Medicine Horse called the group to order by beginning a traditional song, his deep voice filling the room with ancient melodies that seemed to resonate in the very walls. The children, even the teenagers who might normally have been self-conscious, joined in with respectful attention. When the song concluded, Frank spoke about the importance of stories in Apache tradition. "Our stories are not just entertainment," he said. "They are teachers, carrying lessons about how to live properly in this world. When we listen to these stories, we connect ourselves to thousands of years of Apache wisdom." The first storyteller was Mary Running Wolf, an 80-year-old woman who was one of the reservation's most respected keepers of oral tradition. She had known Elena well, and the two women had often shared stories and discussed the best ways to preserve cultural knowledge for future generations. Mary positioned herself in the center of the room, with children sitting in a circle around her, exactly as Elena had done in her living room years earlier. But, here, in this purpose-built space, the tradition could reach a larger audience and continue indefinitely. "Today I will tell you about Coyote and the Fire Mountain," Mary announced. "This is a very old story, one that our ancestors told when they first came to this land. It teaches us about courage, wisdom, and the responsibility we have to help others." Miguel settled against the wall and watched as Mary began her tale. Her voice carried the rhythm and cadence of oral tradition, rising and falling with the story's emotional peaks and valleys. The children were completely absorbed, even the teenagers putting aside their typical reserve to focus on the ancient narrative. The story told of Coyote's journey to steal fire from the mountain spirits, bringing warmth and light to human beings who were suffering in cold and darkness. But Mary's telling emphasized themes that went beyond the basic adventure plot: the importance of community cooperation, the value of wisdom over strength, and the idea that great accomplishments required sacrifice for the common good. As the story progressed, Miguel noticed that Tom and Ellen Bennett were equally absorbed in Mary's narrative. Ellen took notes discreetly, clearly recognizing the educational value of traditional stories, while Tom listened with the focused attention of someone discovering an entirely new perspective on familiar landscape. When Mary concluded her story, she invited questions from the young listeners. Rosa Santos raised her hand immediately. "Mrs. Running Wolf," she said, "how do we know which stories are true and which are just teaching tales?" Mary smiled at the question. "That is a very good question, and very hard to answer. Apache stories work differently than the history books you study in school. Some stories describe things that really happened. Some stories describe things that could happen. And some stories describe things that should happen if we live correctly." She paused, looking around the circle of young faces. "The important thing is not whether every detail is factual, but whether the story teaches us something useful about how to live. Coyote probably did not literally steal fire from mountain spirits, but the story teaches us real truths about courage, cleverness, and helping others." David Crowfeather, who had become increasingly interested in traditional culture throughout the construction project, asked the next question. "How do we decide which stories to preserve?" "There must be hundreds of Apache tales." "Thousands," Mary corrected. "And you are right that we must choose carefully which ones to emphasize. We preserve the stories that teach the most important lessons for each generation." Frank Medicine Horse added his perspective. In the old days, certain stories were told only at specific times of year, or only to people who had reached certain ages. We still follow some of those traditions, but we also recognize that our young people need access to cultural knowledge year-round. The second storyteller was Robert Begay, who had served not only as the project's electrician but also as a keeper of historical narratives about Apache resistance and survival during the reservation period. His story focused on Geronimo's leadership during the Apache Wars, but emphasized themes of strategic thinking and adaptation rather than simple warfare. Geronimo was not just a warrior, Robert explained. He was a leader who understood that survival required changing tactics when circumstances changed. When traditional warfare was no longer effective, he developed new strategies. When those strategies stopped working, he changed again. Miguel was struck by how relevant Robert's historical narrative was to contemporary challenges facing Apache communities. The need for adaptation, the importance of strategic thinking, and the value of persistent resistance to forces that threatened cultural survival, these lessons applied as much to modern educational and economic challenges as they had to 19th-century military conflicts. Ellen Bennett was clearly moved by Robert's story. During the question period that followed, she asked, "How do you help children understand the connection between historical resistance and current cultural preservation efforts?" Robert smiled at her question. "We teach them that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes resistance means fighting. Sometimes it means refusing to give up your language or your traditions. And sometimes resistance means building something new, like this cultural center, that ensures your culture has a place to grow." The final storyteller was Jimmy Crowfeather, who had emerged as one of the project's most dedicated supporters despite his initial skepticism about anything that seemed too much like going backward. His story was about contemporary Apache life, focusing on a young man who left the reservation for college and career opportunities but eventually returned to contribute to his community's development. "This story is still being written," Jimmy said. "Every young Apache person who goes out into the world and, then, chooses to bring their skills back home is adding new chapters to our people's story." Marcus Crowfeather, Jimmy's son, asked the final question of the session. "Dad, what if someone learns about Apache culture but decides they can serve their people better by staying in the outside world? Are they betraying their heritage?" Jimmy considered the question carefully before responding. "Apache culture has always valued individuals who serve the community in whatever way is needed. Sometimes the community needs people who understand both Apache ways and outside ways. The important thing is maintaining connection and contributing somehow to the survival and growth of our people." As the formal storytelling session concluded, Miguel felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Elena's place had served its intended function perfectly. Children had learned traditional stories, adults had shared cultural knowledge, and everyone present had participated in the kind of community gathering that strengthened cultural continuity. But, more than that, the session had demonstrated something that Miguel had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. The cultural center was already becoming a place where tradition and innovation could coexist, where ancient wisdom could address contemporary challenges, and where Apache identity could evolve while remaining rooted in authentic cultural values. Frank Medicine Horse approached Miguel as people began to leave. "This is a good beginning," he said. "But you know that the real work is just starting. Building the center was easy compared to keeping it alive and useful." Miguel nodded. "I know. But after today, I'm confident that the community will support ongoing programs. People are hungry for this kind of cultural connection." Tom Bennett also approached before leaving, with Ellen standing beside him. "Miguel," Tom said, "that was one of the most educational mornings I've ever spent. I learned more about Apache history and values in 3 hours than I had in 40 years of living next to the reservation. Would you be interested in ongoing cultural education programs?" Miguel asked. "I've been thinking about offering sessions specifically designed to help non-Apache neighbors understand local tribal history and contemporary issues. Ellen's eyes lit up. That would be wonderful. There's so much misunderstanding between communities, mostly because people don't have opportunities to learn from each other. As the last visitors departed, Miguel stood alone in Elena's place and absorbed the silence that followed successful community gathering. The building felt different now, no longer an empty structure waiting to fulfill its purpose, but a living space that had begun to accumulate the energy and memory that would define its character. Through the south-facing windows, afternoon light streamed across the floor where children had sat listening to ancient stories. On the walls, displays of traditional artifacts and contemporary Apache artwork created a visual narrative of cultural continuity and adaptation. And, in the air itself, Miguel could almost hear the echo of voices, past, present, and the future, that would fill this space with the ongoing conversation between tradition and change. Elena's dream was becoming reality, but in ways that even her wisdom had not fully anticipated. The cultural center was not just preserving the past, it was creating space for Apache culture to grow and evolve while remaining authentically connected to its deepest roots. 6 months later, Elena's place had become the heartbeat of cultural life on the reservation. What had begun as Miguel's solitary dream had evolved into a thriving community institution that exceeded everyone's expectations. The building hummed with activity throughout the week, language classes on Monday evenings, traditional arts workshops on Wednesdays, storytelling sessions every Saturday morning, and special events that drew visitors from across the region. Miguel arrived early each day, not because the center required constant supervision, but because he treasured the quiet hours before the day's activities began. This morning was particularly special. Sarah, his daughter, had driven up from Phoenix for the cultural center's official dedication ceremony, the first time she would see the completed project that had consumed her father's energy for the better part of a year. "Dad," Sarah said as she examined the interior displays, "this is incredible. When you first told me about your plan to build something with scrap lumber, I was worried you were taking on too much. But this..." She gestured around the beautifully appointed space. "This is professional quality." Miguel smiled at his daughter's amazement. Sarah was a successful nurse in the city, practical and focused on measurable outcomes. Her approval of the cultural center meant more to him than she probably realized. "I had a lot of help," he said simply. The morning's dedication ceremony would mark the center's formal opening to the broader community, but Miguel had insisted on beginning with a private family gathering. Sarah had brought her 2 children, 8-year-old Jacob and 12-year-old Anna, for their first extended visit to their grandfather's reservation. The children had spent their lives in urban environments, with only limited connection to their Apache heritage. Anna examined the wall displays with the intense curiosity of a pre-teenager discovering family history she had never fully understood. "Grandpa," she said, "why don't we learn about any of this stuff in school?" Miguel knelt beside his granddaughter, remembering Elena's patience when faced with similar questions from confused children. "Most schools teach the history that affects the most people," he explained. "Apache stories are important to us, but there aren't enough Apache children in city schools to make our history a priority." "But that's not fair," Anna protested with the moral clarity that often accompanies early adolescence. "You're right," Miguel agreed. "It's not fair. That's why places like this are important. We have to take responsibility for preserving and teaching our own cultural knowledge." Jacob, younger and more interested in immediate experiences than historical analysis, was drawn to the traditional games and activities that were displayed in one corner of the center. Miguel showed him how to play Apache stick games and explained the mathematical thinking that traditional games were designed to develop. These games taught children how to think strategically and work with probability, Miguel said as Jacob attempted to master the stick game. "Your ancestors were mathematicians and scientists, even though they didn't call themselves by those names." Sarah watched her children engage with their cultural heritage and felt a pang of regret that she hadn't made more effort to maintain these connections while living in the city. Her nursing career had demanded complete focus, and the immediate needs of urban life had gradually displaced the deeper questions of cultural identity that now seemed so important. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think I made a mistake moving so far from home." Miguel looked at his daughter with understanding rather than judgment. "You made the choices that seemed right at the time. But it's not too late to rebuild connections. Culture isn't a place, it's knowledge and values that can be carried anywhere." By mid-morning, vehicles began arriving for the dedication ceremony. The invitation had spread far beyond the immediate community, drawing Apache families from neighboring reservations, tribal officials, local politicians, and interested neighbors from surrounding ranches and towns. Miguel was amazed by the turnout. Nearly 200 people gathered around Elena's place. Tom and Ellen Bennett arrived early, accompanied by a surprise guest. Tom's elderly father, William Bennett, had driven down from Montana specifically for the ceremony. At 87, William was the last living person who had known Tom's grandfather personally, and he carried memories of the ranch's earliest years that no one else possessed. "Mr. Running Bear," William said as Tom introduced them, "I've been looking forward to meeting you. When Tom told me about this project and the connection to your great-grandfather, I knew I had to be here." Miguel was moved by the old man's effort to attend the ceremony. William walked with a cane and clearly found travel difficult, but he had made the journey to witness what he saw as the completion of a circle that had begun over a century earlier. "Your great-grandfather saved my father's life and this ranch," William continued. "I grew up hearing that story, and it shaped how I thought about our responsibilities to our neighbors. I'm proud that my family could help complete something Joseph Running Bear started long ago." The formal ceremony began at noon with traditional Apache songs led by Frank Medicine Horse and a group of young drummers. The music carried across the desert landscape, announcing to the world that Apache culture was alive, growing, and confident in its future. Tribal Chairman Robert Yazzie offered opening remarks that placed Elena's place in the context of broader cultural preservation efforts. "This center represents something important," he said. "Not just a building, but a statement that Apache people will determine our own cultural future. We will decide which traditions to maintain, how to adapt to changing circumstances, and what legacy to leave for our children." Miguel had been asked to speak about the project's development, but as he looked out over the crowd of supporters, he found himself overwhelmed by emotion. The journey from his grandmother's deathbed promise to this moment of community celebration seemed almost impossible to believe. 6 months ago, he began, "I was sorting through a pile of discarded lumber, trying to figure out how to build something permanent from temporary materials. Today, we're dedicating a cultural center that represents the best of both tradition and innovation." He paused, gathering his thoughts and his composure. "But this building is not the real accomplishment. The real accomplishment is the community of people who made it possible. Apache families who contributed labor and support. Neighboring ranchers who shared materials and friendship. Young people who discovered pride in their heritage. Elders who found new ways to pass on ancient wisdom." Miguel gestured toward the center's entrance, where Elena's name was carved in both English and Apache. "My grandmother Elena believed that culture is not a museum piece to be preserved unchanged. She taught me that healthy culture is alive, it grows, adapts, and responds to new challenges while maintaining connection to its deepest roots. This center is designed to be a place where that kind of living culture can flourish." The afternoon featured demonstrations of traditional Apache arts and crafts, with master practitioners teaching visitors the basics of beadwork, pottery, and traditional food preparation. Children and adults worked side by side, creating an atmosphere of intergenerational learning that Elena would have approved of completely. Rosa Santos, now a high school senior who had become one of the center's most dedicated young volunteers, organized a presentation about contemporary applications of traditional Apache values. She had developed this program as part of her senior project, and it demonstrated remarkable sophistication in connecting ancient wisdom to modern challenges. Traditional Apache culture emphasized sustainability, community cooperation, and adaptation to environmental change, Rosa explained to her audience. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're exactly the values our world needs to address contemporary problems like climate change, economic inequality, and social division. Miguel watched Rosa's presentation with pride that went beyond personal satisfaction. Here was exactly what Elena had envisioned, a young Apache woman who understood both her cultural heritage and its relevance to contemporary issues, confidently sharing that knowledge with others. David Crowfeather had also blossomed during the center's development. His construction experience had sparked an interest in architecture, and he was now planning to study engineering with a focus on sustainable building design for rural and reservation communities. Working on this center taught me that traditional building methods often made more environmental sense than modern techniques, David explained during his portion of the afternoon program. Apache architecture was designed to work with natural systems rather than against them. That's something we need to rediscover. As the afternoon progressed, Miguel found himself in conversation with visitors from other tribal communities who were interested in developing similar cultural centers. Word of Elena's place had spread throughout the region, carried by the informal networks that connect native communities across vast distances. The key, Miguel told a group of visitors from a Navajo community, was getting the whole community involved in construction. People support what they help to build. If this had been my personal project, it would never have developed the kind of community ownership that makes it sustainable. A delegation from the state's Department of Education had also attended the ceremony, drawn by reports of the center's innovative approach to cultural education. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the state's Native American Education Coordinator, spent considerable time examining the center's educational materials and programs. This is exactly the kind of community-based cultural education that we're trying to support statewide, she told Miguel. Would you be interested in developing a model program that could be adapted by other tribal communities? The possibility of Elena's place serving as a prototype for similar centers in other communities was both exciting and daunting. Miguel recognized that success brought new responsibilities and opportunities, but also new challenges. As evening approached and the formal ceremony concluded, Miguel found himself surrounded by family and friends in the center's main room. The building felt warm and alive, filled with the laughter and conversation of people who had found something valuable in this space. Sarah approached her father with Jacob and Anna in tow. "Dad," she said, "the kids and I have been talking. We want to spend more time here. Maybe we could come up for a month each summer so they can really learn about their Apache heritage." Miguel felt his heart swell with happiness. Sarah's offer represented exactly the kind of cultural connection that the center was designed to facilitate, urban Apache families rediscovering their roots and maintaining relationships with their traditional communities. "That would make your grandmother very happy," he told his grandchildren. "There's always work to do here, and young hands are always welcome." Tom Bennett approached as the evening wound down, carrying a manila envelope that contained something he wanted to share privately with Miguel. "These are copies of my grandfather's journals from his first years on the ranch," Tom said. "I thought you might want to include some of this material in your historical displays. The entries about Joseph Running Bear are particularly detailed." Miguel opened the envelope and examined photocopies of handwritten pages that documented the relationship between Tom's grandfather and his own great-grandfather. The historical record would add another dimension to the center's educational programs, providing documentation of the cross-cultural cooperation that had made survival possible for both communities. "Tom," Miguel said, "I want you to know that your family's support has meant more than just materials and labor. You've helped prove that different communities can work together when they focus on shared values rather than historical differences." As the last visitors departed and Miguel locked Elena's place for the evening, he stood for a moment in the gathering darkness and listened to the desert silence. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the arroyos, their voices carrying messages that had echoed across this landscape for thousands of years. Elena's promise had been kept, but in ways that exceeded even her remarkable vision. The cultural center was not just preserving Apache traditions, it was creating space for those traditions to grow, adapt, and inspire new generations of cultural leaders. Miguel walked slowly back to his trailer, thinking about tomorrow's activities and next month's programs and next year's possibilities. At 63, he had learned that the most important buildings are not constructed from lumber and nails, but from human connections, shared purposes, and the patient work of bringing dreams into reality. Behind him, Elena's place settled into the quiet that precedes dawn, ready to begin another day of bridging past and future, tradition and innovation, individual dreams and community needs. The Apache had labored with leftover wood, but they had built something that would endure long after the last board weathered to dust. The stories would continue, the language would survive, and the children would know who they were and where they came from. Elena's voice whispered approval in the evening breeze, and her grandson smiled in the darkness, knowing that some promises transcend the limitations of any single lifetime.